Hi, and welcome to Steve Wraith's interviews. And I've got another great guest with me today. It is Jamie Hull, the author of Life on a Thread. Hi, Jamie. How are you?
Hey, Steve. How you doing there, mate?
Yeah, great. Thanks for agreeing to come on. Great to see you. And I've followed your story since I saw you interviewed on the television, actually, on the news about the book coming out. And obviously got a copy of the book and read through it. And wow, what a life story, what a life journey. And just thought it would be great to share it with my viewers on my channel. And, let's go back to the very beginning. Just tell us a little bit about, where you grew up and your early days, your childhood.
Yeah, so I was actually born in Luton in Bedfordshire back in the day. And I grew up initially in Luton, and then family moved over to Leighton Buzzard in Beds. It's just another town on the other side of the county, about 12 mile up the road. So I went to school in Leighton Buzzard, fast forward to sort of high school and everything. And I guess growing up in school, I was always quite driven, to be active, quite athletic. I was interested in football, rugby, athletics, bit of cricket, but I was a lousy batsman, for the record. And I'm really, what I was all about from a young age was sort of challenge and adventure, and really taking life by the horns and getting the most out of it. Really, when I left school, I took off backpacking around the world, and I didn't come home for well over a year. And I travelled throughout Africa, Australasia, New Zealand, Fiji, Hawaii, North America, and I really was, like I said, I was really sort of just making the most out of a younger life back then, and really, getting what experience I could. And then of course the reality of sort of adulthood kicked in, and I had to come back home and consider starting a career.
You were into your sports at school. What were you like academically?
I mean, academically, I was probably a Joe average, really, when it came to academics. I mean, maybe a little bit above average when I applied myself. But I was I never really possessed, the academic sort of brains of an archbishop, but I was always capable. So if I was interested in something and I applied myself, then, I genuinely did pretty well in the sort of progression of things in life. So initially in school, I was a bit of a tearaway for a little while, and I actually failed a year with sort of GCSE grades, and I actually went back to repeat that. But then went on straight after that year, having got some reasonable, decent grades for GCSE. I went on to do some A-levels, picked up 3 decent A-level grades, at least good enough for sort of government work. And then I toyed with the idea of going to university quite young, but actually ended up doing that somewhat later in life as a mature student in my mid-20s. So it was one of those things that if I really applied myself, then I could pull things out of the bag. But, initially in the early years, I probably wasn't all that interested in school and academia. I was more sort of sports and sort of challenge and adventure and just getting out there in the world,
Was it a happy childhood?
Not bad. But to be fair, I guess it's not unique in my sense that, the story that my parents separated when I was quite young. And I mean, I was only about 12. So that had some difficulties for me because I was kind of getting on with it. And on one hand, it was promoting independence because, you've got to sort of, be forced to sort of work and perhaps, do things for yourself if one of your parents kind of clears off. And my parents separated, like I say, just because they simply weren't getting on. And I think that was just on the cards. But good for independence, but not so good because you've got a relative lack of parental supervision. So what I meant by that was that, I was largely then left to my own devices, and sort of I could be sort of swanning off to sort of all hours, sort of just hanging out, on the street. And whereas I probably should have been at home, sort of cracking on and getting on with the schoolwork. But so it was a challenging childhood, by no means a sort of a sob story, but somewhat happy when I look back to sort of the formative years. But I think my teenage years weren't necessarily the happiest, and I was forced to sort of be quite independent and to really survive, really, and become that true survivor, as it were. But inadvertently, I think it's perhaps a a skill set that I developed that would definitely go on to aid me in adult life, and certainly, with reference to what I ended up doing, going on to work with the forces and so on, and indeed, coming through a life-changing injury, which I'll come on to.
Yeah. What did the young Jamie Hull aspire to be? I mean, what was your aims and ambitions as a youngster?
I think my greatest, interest was probably the armed forces. So I was always kind of geared up that way. I remember having chats with careers advisors in the high school. You get like occasional one-to-one sessions, talk about what your perhaps personal ambitions were and where you saw yourself. And we talked about the Marines because that came up, because I was quite athletic, I was quite fit, I was quite driven by the action. And so I think it was suggested to me that the Marines could perhaps offer me, that kind of road and those kind of opportunities. And it was possibly on the cards, but like I said, I made a concerted effort so when I left school and the A-levels, as it were, I ended up doing work for about a year or so, save up some pennies and, and get some cash behind me in order that I could get out in the world and make that big sort of round the world sort of backpacking trip. So I did exactly that. I remember going to a Trailfinders in London, got my ticket for round the world, and cost me about just over £1,000. So I mean, that was for a complete round the world sort of circumnavigation trip with all the different flights, which was probably, quite a lot of money back then, but it just goes to show inflation. So I did all these flights for about £1,000, but literally went all around the world. And I mean, I was fully independent in that process. And that taught me a lot, really. And talk about university of life. So I kind of got that, from 1920 or so. And that really was to sort of set me up for the future.
What kind of places did you visit?
So I went to, flew down from London Heathrow, given that I was just a 19-year-old kid, and I flew down from Heathrow to Johannesburg, which, it's a little bit dodgy when you're on the ground there. And, there's certainly a bit of a hazardous sort of nature to Johannesburg. And I spent time on the ground in Joburg. I ended up hitchhiking down to Cape Town in South Africa, traveling around most of South Africa. Then I went up to the north. So I took a trip up to Namibia through Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, even crossed the Angolan border, went up to Malawi, ended up coming back to Cape Town, long story short, because somebody offered me a job. And I was working on a market in Camps Bay on the Peninsula Road from the Cape Town round towards Cape of Good Hope, and that was amazing. I mean, I was working on this market and I was working as a salesman. I mean, I wasn't much cop, but I had to sort of learn the gift of the gab to sort of help me to do the sales work, and basically selling everything from small soapstone carvings to literally 8-foot high carvings of giraffes and big fat hippopotamus and stuff like that. So it was an amazing life experience, and to have all that quite young. And then from Southern Africa, I went on to Australia, and I literally travelled all around Australia. I worked, I had some pretty random jobs, did a bit of gardening work. I think I worked for about 2 weeks in McDonald's in Sydney, but that was, not too much fun, really, coming back honking of burgers or whatever. So I ended up getting a job slightly better. I got picked up for a role actually working in a cocktail bar in King's Cross, which is a really vibrant nightlife area. So there I was, black dicky bow tie, white shirt, and I'm working as this kind of, literally, that movie Cocktail, the old movie with Tom Cruise. I was literally doing that job, mate. I mean, I wasn't probably as proficient as him in the movie, spinning everything around, but he probably had tons of practice for that one. But I was literally serving up, all the punters, for the high end sort of cocktails in that bar, and this was one of the cutting edge nightlife sort of after hours establishments for entertainment in the heart of Sydney. So it was a really well established bar called the Bourbon. And I think if there's any Australians that get to listen in, they'll probably know exactly where I'm talking about. So on the Darlinghurst Road, King's Cross, in the heart of Sydney. and the bourbon, or the bourbon and beefsteak, as I think it was called back then. It was a pretty major establishment. I was really lucky to get the job in there, and that paid me quite handsomely. I saved up a load of like Aussie dollars in the bank account, and then I went north, and then I actually volunteered my services, which is quite interesting because it's testimony to how you can achieve great things if you actually do put yourself forward. You know, take the courage to put your best foot forward, to volunteer in life. So I ended up doing some voluntary work for the dive industry. And then let's fast forward about 6 months. Eventually, I became a certified PADI dive master. So what that meant, I was able to then go out and work in the industry, you know, earn some money again, earn my keep. And I was guiding divers on the Great Barrier Reef. So on a ratio of 1, that's me, to 8 as a dive master, I was able to guide the tourist divers on the reef. And I was able to teach, or rather assist the instructors working out there in Australia, and keep my hand in doing that. So it was a really fantastic sort of stepping stone for me. I ended up later on doing a lot of work in the dive industry, but that was like the starting point for me, sort of volunteering in Australia and working on the magnificent Great Barrier Reef. So it was a magical time. And then sort of shot round Australia to get round, if you like, on my trip. And I went through New Zealand, did a bit of skiing in the South Island in the middle of winter, went up to Fiji, and I was doing a little bit more diving on the way home, and then Hawaii, sort of same again, bounced up to North America. I got a car in North America. I drove across all of the states and ended up from sort of California all the way across to Florida. And literally, then the last hop was like sort of Miami, Paris, London. And I'd been on the road for like well over a year. So it was a massive life experience. And yeah, that massively set me up with like confidence as a young man. But then saying that, you know, the reality of like having to settle back in the UK after that wonderful, big, fat global adventure became apparent. And, you know, then I got to think seriously, okay, what the hell am I going to do now for a career? And I must admit, when I got back after that trip, I was really quite unsettled and kind of fretting about the future. And, you know, so that then took a slightly different turn.
So what was the next step, Jamie?
Yeah, so from the travel, again, I considered the armed forces because I kind of wanted to get back out there in the world. And I thought, you know, what role or job back in England is possibly going to give me that kind of adventure? And, you know, the kind of like thirst for, you know, challenge and adventure that I was looking for. And so I think I made some brief inquiries about the forces, but a friend of mine actually at the time was a serving officer with the police, with Bedfordshire Police, and said about that career. And he was kind of filling me in about what they do on a day-to-day basis and kind of his life and what was going on. And I thought that was quite exciting, what he was getting up to, this old friend of mine. So I can remember like literally, you know, sat in the pub with him having a beer, and we'd sort of talk about it. And so I guess he inspired me. And at that stage, I was only probably about 21. So I picked up the phone. They weren't recruiting. This was Beds Police, so my county where I'd sort of grown up, sort of born and bred. But they said to me, yeah, but we got Thames Valley up the road, which is another force. And I believe they might be recruiting. I can give you the number. And so I said, yeah, okay, I'll give them a call. So I rang up Thames Valley. They were recruiting. And at that time, believe it or not, I was actually working in a women's lingerie manufacturer in the UK called Gossard's. And I think Gossard's is famous for I think is it the Wonder Bra?
Yeah,
you remember
that's right.
that all the, you know, the young girlies or whatever aspire to wear, you know, it gives them a bit of boost in that department. So I was working in this famous factory, manufacturing with the Wonder Bra for Gossard's. But the truth is, I was working as a quality controller. It's not as glamorous as it sounds. I was just sort of testing and inspecting the raw materials when they were coming in the back door with the big deliveries. I wasn't really involved with the sort of, let's just say, the sort of beautiful model end of it, you know, where the girls are parading themselves in the Wonder Bra and advertising. So that wasn't my bag. But I moved on from Gossard because the truth was, during that sort of 10, 11 months or so, I did the selection for the Thames Valley, and then luckily I got into the force, pretty young. They said in the interview, "Oh, we're gonna, you've had an interesting sort of young life experience traveling the world and guiding people on the Great Barrier Reef, etc. And we kind of like the sound of you." But they were aware of a minor criminal record that I possessed. So I think in my younger teens, I'd been lifted a couple of times for, for the record for a bit of theft and I think for criminal damage. But the truth was, I'd got away with a hell of a lot when I was a kid. I was a bit of a tearaway for a few years before I managed to turn my life around. But then, as I said, like when I got interviewed for the police for that final selection board, they were like, "Okay, we're aware of your youth, as it were, and your antics, but we're prepared to take a bit of a gamble on you. And let's hope you don't disappoint us." So that was it, thumbs up. I was given the job. And then I started my probation in earnest at like 21 years of age. So then I'm cutting around the Thames Valley. And so what that meant in a nutshell, I was one of those really annoying blokes that, screaming around in the police car, "Please don't hold it against me." But I was sort of lights and sirens, days, lates and night shifts, chasing the bad guys and trying to sort of put band-aids, on the sort of victims of crime, so to speak. And it wasn't an easy job. I mean, hats off, now, I've got quite a few mates that are still in the police even now. And I mean, I left sort of 20 years ago, but it's a tough old job. You're picking up the pieces, you're trying to sort of patch up the difficulties in people's lives. And, there's a lot of people out there and there's a lot of repeat sort of perpetrators of crime and the criminals themselves they're talking about. It tended to be a lot of the same old faces that I was chasing and trying to sort of, get them convicted and through the courts because, they were tend to be repeat offenders, and the safest place for them really and for society was back in the nick, was back in the jail. But it's frustrating. You don't always get the results that you want, and you're sort of chasing your tail with everything, and it can be quite stressful because of the changes of shift pattern from days to lates to nights. So for me, fantastic life experience, but I only did a few short years. And that wasn't because of any detriment to the police and what that represented. It was just the fact that I thought, for me, remember, I was all about that challenge and adventure. And after sort of 3 years, I was a bit long in the tooth with it all and a bit frustrated, I guess. And I really, truthfully just wanted to get back out there in the world and see what opportunities were back out there so I could have some real adventure once again. And I felt that was somewhat lacking in my role as a police constable, in my younger 20s.
So you decided to swap one uniform for another then, Jamie, I guess, and another discipline required, a different discipline required in that career that you always chased.
I did, mate. Yeah. So again, I was always interested in the armed forces, and I think in hindsight, they say, if you could have your time over again, would you do it differently? I think the one thing that I would have probably changed was that from school, I may have still done the backpacking trip because that was, like I said, wonderful life experience, sort of university of life, so to speak. But I think I probably would have gone straight into the armed forces because that, the reality of getting opportunities to travel the world and see more of the world. And I was always interested in that, the different cultures and the different sort of environments from the tropics to sort of temperate to mountains to desert and Arctic even. And that really interested me. And of course, you're not going to get that in any sort of local role, police force or otherwise in the UK. So that was the only reason for me why I wanted to move on. Because remember, I'd had that exposure as a young traveller. And so I was kind of looking for that really once again in a way. So I did move on. And as you rightfully said, so I did eventually swap uniforms, but not straight away. So how it went was that I applied for a sabbatical, and that was like an official career break. And back then, believe it or not, they gave you up to 5 years. So I actually said to the governors at the time with my job with, the police force with Thames Valley, I said, look, I'm interested in maybe doing a little bit more travel, possibly doing a bit more in the dive industry because I've got the tickets now. And by then I was a qualified instructor. And But I said I'm also potentially interested in maybe going off to do some higher education and university potentially with my career break. So hence why I was able to take the extended career break up to those 5 years, which absolutely, I was gobsmacked that they offered me that. But that was, you know, it was a bit of a magic move, I felt. So off I went, and I was still a relatively young guy. I was still only sort of mid-20s, and I did indeed go off to do some really remote work in the dive industry. So I went and ran a dive exped in the Philippines, in a really remote South China Sea in Far East Asia. So I was off, if anyone knows on the map, a place called Palawan in the southwest of the Philippines. I was just to the north of the Palawan province, and I spent 6 months out there living like literally Robinson Crusoe. And I was responsible for about 50 divers at any one time. They were mostly like young gap year, like young men and women. And I was training, and I was kind of health and safety, keeping everybody safe, and basically, you know, managing the sort of day-to-day functions and running of the exped. And I had some wonderful experiences doing all that. You know, a lot of things happened when we had boats capsize. We lost some scuba units to the bottom of the ocean. And then I found that the local people, it got washed up on shore back on the mainland. And I had some of the locals trying to sell it back to me, which was quite entertaining. But we had sort of near misses, you know, on exped. And, you know, you've got to be really resourceful, and you've got to be resilient to kind of maintain yourself. But not just you, but, you know, remember, I was responsible for a lot of bodies out there on the exped. So forget the sort of health and safety of the diving for a moment. That's challenging enough. But the hardest thing I had to deal with was actually keeping 50 people sort of fed and watered, you know, and organising, food and all the rest of it, and bussing in like blue barrels of water from the mainland. So we had to be transported 3 hours over the local South China Sea to get to the island location. So it was really quite a lot of graft working on exped, and it's no glamorous thing to kind of to live up to, but all the same, wonderful life experience. It taught me a lot about character. It taught me a lot about digging deep, and above all, it taught me to sort of look out for my sort of fellows, or my oppos, as it's called in the forces. And so even before I got involved in the armed forces, you know, I kind of learned a lot about, you know, teamwork and that sort of essence, that ability to sort of to dig in for the sake of your, you know, your buddies on tour, so to speak. And anyway, so that was a life experience. I ended up coming back from my travels, doing some diving. I worked briefly in the Red Sea in Egypt as well, for a big commercial centre out there. And then I took myself off on the higher education. So I didn't just talk the talk, I walked the walk. And at the ripe old age, so I was now like 25, and I went up to the University of East Anglia, so UEA in Norwich, and I embarked on a languages degree, actually, and I was doing Scandinavian languages, so BA honours. And the reason I did that was because I had some family influence on my mother's side, I guess, that I was quite curious about, and I had an opportunity to basically go out and live in Norway. So the reason I mention this, because it was an exciting year for me. So I did my first year in Norwich, second year in Norway, and that was amazing. I took my dive gear out there in the backpack, and I ended up sort of managing to blag a whole year attached to essentially a Norwegian, you know, sort of mountain rescue sort of training type outfit. And this is what this centre did. They kind of trained us in like outdoor pursuits. So I was doing mountaineering, and I was getting trained in, you know, skiing, but proper, you know, Nordic skiing, you know, with a big pack on your back, going deep into the mountains, you know, navigating on a map and compass. So they were teaching us to do all that. And again, this was long before the forces. And I was doing ski mountaineering, you know, regular skiing. I was doing lots of kayaking in the Norwegian fjords and down the rivers and stuff like that. And indeed, you know, rock face climbing. And I took my dive gear out there. So I was even diving in the deep fjords, and I did some crazy deep dives down to like 50, 60 meters through the ice in the middle of winter. So this there was me, you know, I talk about Jamie Hull version 1.0, i.e. my old self, you know, my former self, pre-injury. And I had this wonderful really wide, dramatic life experience, probably way more than Joe average. And that's not a boast. It's just by virtue of what happened. You know, I went backpacking, I had all these kind of outside the box experiences that a lot of young people don't necessarily have. And then I ended up doing, you know, random jobs around the world, then coming back and doing kind of pretty mainstream jobs in the UK, then joining the police, which is quite an extraordinary career in its own right, then going off on sabbatical to do expedition work, and then commercial work in the dive industry, teaching and guiding. But then when I went off to uni, in my second year, I was in Norway doing all the things that I was doing and all this adventurous sports and pursuits and like the mountain training and the mountain rescue type endeavors. So I was a really rounded person by the time I was 25 years of age. And I guess the bottom line was I was always hungry from there on next. I was like, okay, what's next? What else can I do? How can I exploit this life and really make the most of it? And so the interesting thing was at uni, that's when I joined the army. So that's when I traded the uniform that you suggested earlier on.
Yeah.
So when I went to uni, and I was I actually volunteered again. So the testimony of how voluntary work can pay off once again. So I volunteered my services for none other than a unit called Cambridge University Officer Training Course. So that was just down the road, Cambridge. And it turned out that UEA made up about 50% of the manpower at Cambridge OTC. So I was invited to come along to do this selection. The next thing I know, I'm sort of like onboarded with Cambridge OTC. And this was a wonderful unit. So pretty much a recruitment workshop for the British Army. And what I mean by that, you get loads of exposure. I got loads of FAM visits, so FAM. It stands for familiarisation. So for example, one weekend I was off playing with could have been the Royal Anglian Regiment, and I was getting exposure to, you know, what those infantry boys were doing, you know, the soldiers and the officers. And I was learning all about what it was to be an infantier in the British Army infantry unit. And then the next weekend that I was away doing something, it might have been, say, Royal Artillery, and I was invited down to Larkhill on the ranges, and they were really trying to sort of seduce me and say, look, this is what we're all about. This is the Royal Artillery. And then I'm playing in, you know, with 105mm light guns. I'm playing, literally getting like chaperoned around in the back of an AS-90. You know, so all of these wonderful experiences as doing the FAM visits. And then that kind of escalated with Cambridge OTC. So I showed keen, and I ended up volunteering we did a selection. So we ended up doing a couple of Cambrian patrols. And this was pretty epic. So this was real meat on the bone for me as a young soldier, like learning the ropes with the Cambridge OTC, because I got to go off and trudge around Wales. To put it into perspective for you, so I was part of an 8-man patrol, for example, that got selected.
Yeah.
And we were up in Wales, big heavy packs on our back, and we were like trudging over the damp, boggy, sort of like babies' heads, you know, the squidgy sort of grassy tufts in Brecon Beacons and Black Mountains. And we were covering like 50-kilometre routes as part of the Cambrian patrol. And I'm only a basic soldier, you know, I'm only an officer cadet. But the experience that I got from doing that was like epic, because I was up there with regular units. So I was up there, they send in patrols from the Marines, from the Parachute Regiment, from foreign forces all over the world. And the truth is, a lot of these patrols don't even make it, because it's nails, you know, the Cambrian patrol. It's the Army's, British Army's premier patrolling competition. Anyway, I did 2 of these, one year, you know, following the other. And the first year, I think we got a bronze with Cambridge. And the second year, you know, the kudos to us was that we actually got a silver medal. And that was really hard to get that medal. I mean, we really pulled it out of the bag to win points and to score prizes, so to speak, and to win through on that patrolling competition. But in a nutshell, the reason I mention this is because, you know, the confidence that gave me as a young sort of aspiring soldier, if you will, with the Cambridge OTC was absolutely immense. So that confidence then led me forwards. And then I thought, well, this is amazing. What else can I get out of this unit? So I remember talking to the PSIs, the permanent staff instructors, who then spoke to the CO, the commanding officer, on my behalf and said, okay, we think we've got, you know, Jamie really keen as mustard. You know, he's got quite a lot of life experience already, and he's interested to do possibly one of the more elite unit selections. So I actually put myself forward, and I got, I think, the CO's authority to go off and do what they call P Company, which is the parachute regiment selection for Para Reg, sorry. So it's called P Company, it's Pegasus Company, and they run the course up at Catterick in North Yorkshire. So I volunteered as an officer cadet, so I'm wearing the white t-shirt, and I got a hard time of it because I was an officer cadet. You know, you get a harder time of it than the green t-shirt, which are the privates, and the red t-shirts, which are the NCO. So the white t-shirts get a tougher time because they're really looking at you to really, you know, excel, if you will, and pull it out the bag, that selection process. So you need to be a strong candidate. And a month process on P Company, and it culminates in test week, absolutely horrible. I mean, I felt like I was getting beasted to within an inch of my life on every single event on test week for P Company. Remember, selection for the parachute regiment. And again, hats off to any of the serving paras out there. And they've got a really staunch and a really strong history that goes back to the Second World War, when all those lads were jumping in, you know, to Arnhem, and, you know, all the Second World War sort of infiltration efforts. And that's what all the paras were doing. And there's a reason why they're selected to a high level, because the job is tough. And, you know, not least throwing yourself out of perfectly serviceable aircraft. But the job on the ground, you know, if you're going to work within the patrol of parachute regiment, you know, you need to have a bit about you, and you've got to dig deep, because, you know, it's the nature of the work. It's a lot faster, and, you know, those troops, they mean business. So I was very lucky to be on this process, and I did get selected. And for the record, I got lucky because I surprised myself. I came through the process, and I actually got through it first time, albeit beaten up. I mean, I was black and blue, you know, by the time I got through the milling, you know, the boxing and all the rest of it. I mean, I was properly beaten up. You know, I had like bruised ribs, sort of black eyes, and I mean, I was a mess. It took me about a fortnight to recover. But I'd got through the process, and I was proudly, you know, able to then potentially go on and serve with the parachute regiment. What followed next was going back to unit, back to the OTC, and of course, you know, that was great kudos for me to having got through P Company and got the stand-up pass. And then I was basically invited to do selection with Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. So I went on did a short service commission. So about another month then at the academy at Sandhurst. A tough old course again, because you learn from your mistakes in leadership. And at first you really do mess up things, and you get kind of pulled up, and it feels like you're really being dragged over the coals by the directional staff at Sandhurst. But eventually you learn from your mistakes. And if you take it on the chin and you own up to your mistakes and then sort of learn from your mistakes, then interestingly, you know, there's every chance then, every opportunity that you'll commission. But they want to see good old-fashioned leadership and really good old-fashioned honesty and courage during your time at the academy. So I was lucky again that I commissioned, and again I went back to unit. And by now I'd sort of exhausted all of the opportunities, and it was a case of, okay, so what next? Am I going to consider a career as a regular soldier, like when I graduate and finish my course at uni, or am I going to maybe consider time as a reservist and then maybe continue with some sort of civilian career? So I actually chose to do the latter. I felt that I was a little bit old for potentially opportunities in the regular army full time, because by now I was like late 20s. It's sort of getting on. So I did decide to take a reserve route as a reservist. And then there was a great opportunity that came up, and I was recommended to go forward for selection. Again, it was a voluntary process. I put my best foot forward for selection for UKSF. So that's UK Special Forces Reserve. And then this was a long old process, this one. This was over a year of my life, 13 months to be precise. And I managed to juggle this along the dissertation in the final year. of my academic studies at uni with the languages degree. And I was always going off to Wales once again and doing all the nitty gritty training with selection for the SAS. And then finally, I surprised myself once again. I was pretty robust, so I didn't do anything silly like roll an ankle or sort of like, you know, take probably the wrong exit off the edge of Penny Fan and, you know, tumble down into oblivion. Luckily, I was pretty strong at map reading and navigation. I think my time in Norway in those years preceding had sort of helped me. And yeah, I surprised myself, to be honest there, Steve, you know, and I got through the process. So I was a young, robust, hungry character. That's Jamie Hull version 1.0, the old me.
Yeah.
And I got through the process, and then I was in service. So I was then able to join the squadron. So join my regiment. So 2-1 SAS. And I did actually, you know, for the record, I did actually get to serve in locations around the world. Now, it's sensitive, so I'm not sort of at liberty to discuss, you know, where I went, and because I'm subject to a sort of a non-disclosure on that. But I did get, you know, the green light to sort of publish the book with disclosure. So, yeah, for the record, I went to different environments, from sort of hot environments around the world to very cold environments in sort of Arctic. And I did get to sort of put you know, a lot of operational training, as I said, in those different environments, and really get to grips with soldiering, as it were, as a reservist within, you know, the SAS. And it was my, you know, some of my most proudest moments, and actually getting out there in the world and getting to grips with all that, and kind of having those experiences under my belt. And everything was going absolutely hunky-dory. And then, so what happened was in the summer of 2007, so I was basically given the nod. So all of us were within the regiment to say, okay, we've got a big tasking, lads, and it's on. You know, there's a job's on, and you're actually going to be soon to be deploying on an operational deployment. And so we were like, you know, a bit nervous, but a bit sort of, okay, thumbs up, this is game on, we're on for it. And what happened next was basically, we were told we've got a little bit of downtime before we were coming back to ramp up the training, and then we were due to do the operational deployment. And during that downtime, I think we had about a 6-week window before we had to come back and sort of commit, as it were, pre-deployment. And I chose to fulfill a very personal ambition. And now this one goes back to very young childhood. So I was very much inspired by my late grandfather, who trained as a pilot towards the end of the Second World War. And he was also a bit of a spotter with regards to aviation, all things aviation. So as a young kid, remember I said I grew up in Luton.
Yeah.
So from a very young age, he took me down to Luton Airport, and I'm looking from the perimeter through the fence, through the metal fence, and I'm watching all the pilots getting busy on the active runway, sort of throttling up the engines, and I'm getting the noise, you know, coming downwind, and I'm getting that backwash, you know, the kerosene sort of fumes from the backwash. And I was really absorbing all of this, what was going on from a young age. And I always thought, wow, this is amazing. Perhaps one day I wouldn't mind, you know, doing that myself, and perhaps, you know, having the opportunity to fly. But it wasn't until much later, when I had a few quid behind me, you know, I'd been working and I earned a few quid, and luckily the army sort of earned me some money and bits and pieces in life that I'd been, you know, able to work and generate a bit of cash behind me. So I thought, okay, I'm gonna do it now. I'm gonna again walk the walk. I've got my visa from the US Embassy in London. Not easy, because remember it was 2007, so that's post the 9/11 incident in the US, and so they were very, you know, I mean, they're very strict, and for good reason, who they dish out visas for candidates to learn to fly in US airspace, as it were. So I got my visa, and I managed to persuade them that I wasn't a security threat, and off I went. And I went to Florida because of the chance of a better window for, you know, good weather, good sort of meteorological conditions. And indeed, I'd been under instruction for the first few weeks. Then I went solo for about 8 days. So I'd been out there for, you know, three and a half weeks or so, maybe nearly a month. And And by now I'm pilot in command. And on this one particular day, everything took a massive, unprecedented turn out of the blue. So even though it was a bluebird day, and what I meant by that, blue sky, big, fat, fluffy clouds, good conditions for flying. I remember being at 1,000 feet in the pattern, and I was just working in a small municipal aerodrome, and just above in the pattern, circling. And I remember looking out my left-hand canopy window, and I had to do a double take, and suddenly I see this thin streak of visible yellow-orange flame. And no sooner did I realise the flame in the cockpit was when I sort of coming around on my final turns, banking now, made my final left turn into wind. And as I turned into wind for final approach towards the concrete runway below, the fire immediately breached the cockpit below. So I looked down on my feet working on the rudder pedals, and I see this thin streak of flame building up, and the flame was lapping my feet and ankles. And I was initially shocked, the sort of, the surprise of seeing this, like the flame around my feet and ankles. And I'm now descending the aircraft, coming in as quickly as I possibly could, but within reason. I'm setting myself up for an emergency landing. And then I got to about half the height, so about 500 feet, and then the fire was about halfway up in the chamber of the cockpit. And then suddenly I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm not sure I'm going to make it. I think the likelihood is this fire is going to overwhelm me and get the better of me in the cockpit. Knowing that how far I had to still descend in order to hit, touch down on the active runway, I thought it's not going to happen. The fire is going to build up so rapidly now, it's going to overwhelm me. So I came up with a light bulb solution. And what that was, that I was not going to go for the active concrete runway below, and I veered away gently to my left. So I followed the protocol for emergency, and my mind flipped back to the emergency protocol that I'd been taught. So it was just a case of turn off the key to the ignition, turn off the magneto switches, Alpha Bravo, the red switches off, the master switch off, the lights off, the strobes off. In the center column, the fuel pump off, rotate the fuel selector valve off. Everything off. That's on the instrument panel or the dashboard in front of me. I was able to just follow left to right, turn everything off in sequence as I'd been taught. Then I remember ripping off the headset because the communications was futile at that stage. I was too low level. And I'd put in a very hasty mayday, but I was too low level to kind of give them updates. And I had all this going on in the cockpit. So I ripped off my headset, threw it in the opposite footwell, unbuckled my 3-point harness, so that's around the waist and both my shoulders left and right, and then very low level, gliding in sort of 100 feet, judging it purely by eyeball. So I'm looking forward through the canopy window, looking left, looking right, looking for hazards, looking for obstacles, heading towards a grassy stretch, a big wide stretch of sort of grassy embankment. And I'm just gliding in. I'm trying to be as calm and as rational as I could be, but the fire all the time was building up around me in the cockpit. And I mean, those lower reaches, I was literally like left hand on the control stick, right hand on the throttle, and I'm like, in a vain bid, if you will, to protect my airway from possible flame ingress and my eyes from the flames literally lapping around my face, because you can see the burns. And so it was all happening really rapidly, but I was trying to stay as calm as I possibly could. And then following that protocol, and when I literally got to about sort of 50 feet, 40 feet, 30 feet, 20 feet, that was me. So then I was like Jack Rabbit. I managed to clamber up onto the seat. I'd already opened the left-hand door, so it opened to the vertical position, like a Lamborghini style, clambered out onto that left seat, and I just went for it. So that meant I jumped off the back trailing edge of the left wing. I snapped my hands together. I snapped my feet and knees together down below. And so I jumped at a height of about 15 feet. And I was gliding in about 30 knots. So I'd scrubbed off as much airspeed as I possibly could. And I got away with it by a bit of quick thinking, quick action, and some might say the grace of God. But the damage was done. I mean, I landed like a sack of spuds. Sack of spuds, sort of boom, into the ground, feet first. face thrust forward and hit the grass below. And then so I had a secondary impact. So I fractured my nose, my eye sockets on both sides, multiple soft tissue lacerations where the grass ripped open parts of my face through the nose, through the lip. Inadvertently ruptured my colon internally, my large intestine. And I also lacerated my liver, which was bleeding internally, not good. But then the worst of it, on top of all of that I mentioned, the trauma that is, I was actually, for the record, I was 63% third and fourth degree burns. Fourth degree burns means there was exposed bone. My shin bone was really exposed because it had burned for the longest period in the lower reaches of the cockpit. And I mean, I was a devastating trauma. And I knew, I'm there rolling around on the floor, you know, smothering the right shoulder, which was still on fire. I'm patting that out. I'm patting out my right scalp, which you can see got really quite mullered with the flame. And I'm patting out that right scalp. And I knew immediately. So having extinguished the flame, the aircraft in the distance, I physically watched it pile in through sort of hands over face. She was nose heavy, left wing down, and she's no more than 2 double-decker buses away from me, you know, 70 feet or so. And then it subsequently exploded. And I knew in my mind, in my sort of reflection of all of this immediately, I knew that I was done for. I mean, I knew that I was a massive burn. I knew that my life was never going to be the same again. You know, forget being that service guy or that elite soldier. Those days were numbered. And there's nothing I could possibly do to change that. If you like, history had just been written. And I had to face the music, and that was not easy. And I don't know how the hell I held on. I really don't, but I somehow managed to hold on.
Superhuman, mate. There's no other words for it. I mean, you know, that is the one thing that we as humans, you know, can find within us at that time. The thing that always amazes me about your story is how cool, calm, and calculated you were under extreme pressure, knowing that your life was at risk, and you know, to give yourself a fighting chance and to think as calmly was ultimately what saved your life. You know, you could have easily gone down in that plane, and that would have been the end. But we've got about 10 minutes left. Look, the recovery I know has been hard, and it's been intense, and spent a lot of months and years, in fact, in hospital. Let's accentuate the positives. Let's concentrate on the positives. And what you've done since then, you've got your book, which we've had on the screen throughout the interview, Life on a Thread, which is one of those best-selling books on Amazon, and the links are down below in the description. But you've also turned your hand to helping others and a lot of charity work. Tell us a bit about that, Jamie.
Yeah, so I'll talk you through some of that. Let me just run back on, if I can. I don't know if I'm able to share this, actually. It says I'm screen sharing, but it doesn't seem to let me do that at the moment.
All right, no worries, mate. No worries.
Yeah, no worries. It doesn't seem to be happening. It was doing it earlier on when
we were doing the book's the main focus. We want people to buy the book after watching this. So just tell us what you've been up to.
Yeah, so I'll just talk very briefly about the book. So the book kind of talks, in essence, about the early life, and it's basically a double comeback kid type story, this one. So it's powerful. I mean, don't take my word for it. It's been getting some rave reviews on Amazon, and I'm very lucky that I got picked up by Penguin Random House, the publishing company. So they were very, you know, the manuscript is strong. And in essence, the first part of the book sort of talks about, you know, what had actually happened to me, but it digs deep, and it talks about the early years in terms of how I was able to sort of turn my life around from a fairly sort of delinquent sort of escapade in my younger years, and where I was really up to no good, and I was getting into a lot of trouble, and I was on the wrong side of the law, actually. So, you know, the irony is, like I said, I went on to serve with the UK police service, and then I was able to go on and sort of turn my life around much later on, and you know, through a series of unexpected events, I ended up becoming, you know, a serviceman ultimately with UK Special Forces, and my service with 2-1 SAS. So it was a really, you know, rich and colourful life experience in general. But it's also, it really does explore the deeper narrative of what it is to go through a life-changing trauma, with the myriad of what I went through with the burns, the internal injuries, the fractures, and so on. I mean, the fact that I was hospitalized for 2 years, I was drug induced for the first 6 months. I'd had like $2.6 million worth of surgical intervention in the USA. So it's a hugely in-depth medical journey, as well as being a very interesting life account. And ultimately, it goes on to really explain how you can ultimately turn your life around and fashion, the ultimate sort of comeback. And so that's the essence of my story, sort of life on a thread, how my fight for survival made me stronger. But realistically, what I did, so in terms of my recovery, so you talked about let's focus on the positives. And when I found myself in the hospital for 2 years, the first 6 months I was drug induced, so I was completely out of it. I didn't really know what on earth was going on. The only true recollection I have of that was perhaps, the American nurse, which was perhaps looking after me at the time, and that sort of the accent, the American accent that sort of stayed with me. But when I got back to the UK, the first things I've got to do is take responsibility by kind of looking in the mirror and realizing that there was a huge change there to my appearance, going from sort of Jamie Hull version 1.0, as I described, to version 2.0. Big change, the scarring, the swelling, I lost a lot of hair, it's all these kind of things. I lost most of my ears, had other issues going on with the body and physical disability and so on. And, acknowledging what had happened to me, it took me about 3 years of physical healing. It took me about 5 years of mental healing, to get over that kind of mental acceptance, or the cognitive sort of transformational, journey that I went through to properly accept it and get over all the grieving for the old me. Because basically I went from elite soldier to literally ground zero. And that was for me, that was a really tough or a bitter pill to swallow. And through great will and determination, I was able to turn it around. And the way that I did that was through, again, going back to who I was kind of formerly, and pulling out the old DNA deep down, if you like, to drive the new narrative of Jamie Hull forwards. And what I mean by that is, okay, how can I challenge myself once again, but in this new body now, in this new skin? And I'm badly injured, badly scarred, disabled. So what's the new narrative going to be? Okay, well, the toolbox wasn't the same, and I acknowledge that. And there's no way I could be that original sort of SF operative, that soldier anymore. Those days were long gone. But okay, so I had to learn to feed, to write, to walk all over again. And realizing that once I was able to do those very basic fundamental skills all over again, I was able to slowly start pushing the barriers or the envelope. And having learned to walk initially within the hospital, in the hospital room, before too long, I was trying to walk a lap, for example, around the grounds of the wards in the hospital. And then I was trying to push that, and I was trying to walk around the boundary of perhaps the hospital itself in Stoke Mandeville, specifically in Aylesbury. And then that kind of proceeded, and I thought, well, if I can walk, I'm going to really try and push the envelope further and just try and walk more to try and build up my strength and my stamina and my self-esteem. Because it was also helping that cognitive, that mental journey and that acceptance. And so I did. I started walking. I guess it harks back to a military thing. And for the military guys listening in, I tried to walk myself back to the BFT, the basic fitness test distance, which was 8 miles. And that was my target, 8 miles per day. And by the end, it actually took me 3 long years before I was able to hit that target. By the end of the 3rd year, I was up to walking 8 miles per day. And that works out, if you do the maths on that, that was 2,500 miles in the year, because I was walking 7 days a week. And then that gave me more confidence to go on and do bigger challenges and events. I ended up getting picked up, and I got a place for charity to raise monies for Keach Hospice in Luton. So I was able to give back to a little hospice that, in the town where I grew up, for all intents and purposes, and where I was born. and to raise money for some terminally ill children. And so the London Marathon, but it took me 8.5 hours to do that walk, 26 miles around London.
Yeah.
But again, that gave me confidence to go on. I did another charity event for the marathon in New York. All the time, I'm pushing the envelope, pushing it. And New York, I sort of upped my game. I did it in 7 hours and 7. Again, it took me so long because of the physical disability, and I've got paralysis in both of my feet as a result of the burns to my lower limbs. But the great will and determination is my testimony of what it's all about. From New York, I went back to London. I got a third opportunity to do London Marathon a couple of years later, this time raising monies and profile for Help for Heroes. That was my best effort. I don't think I could ever enhance that process. And I managed to do London in 6 hours and 15 minutes. And so ultimately, that was what it was all about for me. Again, pushing the boundary, putting my best effort into life, showing other people that I could still achieve, that you can still achieve if you're up against it. And that, where the odds are stacked up against you, it doesn't mean the end. You can still go on and you can still do things. All right, I might not be that same guy. Like I said, I'm not that kind of, that sort of special forces soldier anymore. Those days are long gone. But my bottom line is simple. Believe in yourself. Understand that you can always make an effort to push forward, despite whatever it is that you're up against. And no matter how dark life may seemingly stoop, you as an individual can take onus, you can take responsibility, you can pull it out the bag, and you can drive on and still achieve wonderful things in life. So fortunately, I was able to go on and do these wonderful challenges and events. I was able to go back to the drawing board. I was able to retrain. I went on to retrain as a mountain leader. I went on to lead a lot of expeditions. I went to the highest level in the dive industry, and I became a PADI course director in recent years. I got a flying scholarship, and I was able to retrain as a solo qualified balloon pilot in the aviation world. And ultimately, as an individual, through belief in myself, I was able to drive on and do all of these things, and then kind of help and inspire others in the process. So that's what my story is all about in a nutshell. If you're interested in the wider narrative, check out Life on a Thread, folks. Thank you.
Jamie, fascinating interview. Honestly, thank you for giving up the time to do that. And like I say to everybody who served, in the military, whether it be, the SAS, the paras, the regular service, whatever, I always say thank you to them, because, for what you've done for us, it's something which, often doesn't get said to military people. But thank you very much for giving up your time and putting your life on the line.
Yeah, cheers, Steve. I appreciate that, mate. It's it is much appreciated. A lot of people say thanks, but especially in reflection of having been a serviceman, I mean, that's the thing that I'm probably most proud about, in terms of my former self, the fact that I did get to serve in various capacities, call it sort of government service, kind of across the board, if you will. But the fact that I got to serve in some small part and sort of have that behind me, is something I'm very proud about, and it's something that I certainly would recommend to the younger generation that might be sort of listening and looking in on this. But the services in general can provide wonderful opportunities, and indeed, we rely on you as the next generation to sort of hopefully carry us forward and do what you do. So thanks a lot, pal, and it's great to be on and to be able to sort of share the story with Steve Wraith and the podcast.
Thanks. The book is available on Amazon and in all good bookshops. Jamie does have a website, jamiehull.co.uk. Fantastic website. He also does public speaking. So if you're looking to book Jamie for an event, I couldn't think of anybody better, really, for an event to come and talk. And you've heard just a small part of what he can talk about today on the podcast. I also uploaded something. I was always very quick to press record on the old video recorder back in the 80s and 90s. And I managed to dig out an old video documentary from Channel 4 called P Company. And of course, you heard Jamie refer to P Company and the training that the guys had to go into back in the day. This is actually a documentary from the 1980s about P Company, taking you through the actual process and following a couple of people's actual journey. So you might want to have something a little bit stronger than a cup of tea, Jamie, to watch that. It might bring back some memories of having to do that again. But it's well worth a watch. I'll stick that in the description box along with a link to Amazon and your website, mate. But thanks for your time.
You're my pleasure, Steve. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.